delighted to see you all back after the session so far, and I do hope you've enjoyed the day. The workshops were absolutely excellent, so may I congratulate all those who have participated in them, and particularly all those who put so much effort into preparing the excellent materials. I'm delighted to welcome to the stage this afternoon David Hawkey, who's here today to inform delegates of the Scottish Government's approach to decarbonisation and the support they're giving housing associations, as well as their role in COP26. David is a relatively recent addition to the Scottish Government, working on heat planning and delivery since 2019. Previously, he was Senior Network Analyst at Ofgem, and before that, Research Fellow at the Institute of Governance in his role at Heat in the City, which is funded by the Research Council's UK Energy Programme. Dave's research has dealt with sustainable heat, energy efficiency, local energy, and the social construction of economic value. Now, Dave, before I hand over to you, it's probably appropriate for me to say that I'm a Scot who's been living in Wales for many, many years, and you are working in Scotland, but currently at your mum's house in Anglesey. So a particularly warm welcome. Croeso, David, over to you.
Thanks ever so much. Yes, so I'm here to talk about our heat and building strategy that we published earlier this month on the 7th of October. So could we have the next slide? Rian, thank you. What I'm going to do is give you an overview of the strategy that we've set out. And you'll see here there are sort of quite a few headings. And one of the important points about the strategy is that it has that breadth. It's important to solve the difficult challenges around heat and buildings to make progress on multiple fronts. So I think it's worth, when we're talking about this, looking at what the Scottish Government is doing across all of those fronts, and as the graphic illustrates, how we're trying to put together the different pieces of the jigsaw puzzle at the same time. So could we have the next slide, please? So the Scottish Government has a number of relevant statutory targets. The two very significant headline ones that drive the heat and building strategy are, on the one hand, our emissions reduction targets, which are to reach net zero by 2045 and achieve a 75% emissions reduction by 2030. But we also, very relevant to heat and buildings, have a statutory target to eradicate fuel poverty by 2040. So that's one of the key challenges of the heat and building strategy, is making sure that we're able to do both of those at the same time, which the challenge arises because in some cases zero emissions heating systems can be more expensive than the current incumbents. So we need to make progress on both fronts. Next slide, please. So those significant headline targets translate into a very ambitious and stretching trajectory for what we need to see happen actually in buildings. So across the building stock by 2045, to be consistent with net zero, we set the target that our buildings and homes no longer contribute to climate change, and that our journey there is part of the wider just transition to net zero. We try and then spell out what that means, and also setting out milestones along the way. So we've set a backstop date of 2033 for all homes to reach an energy efficiency standard that's equivalent to EPCC, with good progress, a large majority of buildings achieving that standard by 2030. And whilst energy efficiency is critically important, both to its own emissions reductions and removing the role of poor energy efficiency as a driver of fuel poverty, by itself, it's not enough to get us to our targets. And so we need very significant upscaling of zero emissions heat across the building stock as well. So to get to our 2030 emissions reduction target, which for buildings, so the buildings contribution to that overall 75% target, we need to see emissions 68% lower by 2030 against the 2020 level. And to do that, our analysis shows that requires the vast majority of off-gas homes, so that's oil and LPG homes, switching to zero emissions heat. At least 1 million on-gas homes switching to zero emissions heat. In Scotland, there are about 2 million homes, so that's about half of the on-gas housing stock, and the equivalent of 50,000 non-domestic buildings. So this is a really significant challenge, and represents a significant ramping up of deployment levels against where we are today, where in recent years we've seen sort of in domestic installations around 3,000 zero emissions heat systems going in each year. So we have a real challenge to ramp up that deployment rate in order to reach these targets. Next slide, please. So how are we going about this in terms of thinking about what technologies are appropriate to the housing stock? That urgency, driven by the imperative of the climate emergency to make rapid progress, means that we need to start with the technologies that are available today. So we take as far as we can, a no and low regrets approach to identifying strategic technologies and suitable places for their use. So they are energy efficiency, which is an important contribution across the whole of the building stock. In off-gas areas, the strategic priority is deployment of heat pumps. In on-gas areas, we also want to see deployment of heat pumps. This is perhaps not across the entirety of the gas network, but in areas where alternative zero emissions gas substitutes for natural gas may not be available, or there's a lower likelihood. And we also want to see deployment of zero emissions heat networks, and they're most suitable to areas that have a relatively high density. So we want to make progress with these technologies and ramp up their deployment in the near term, but we're also conscious that we need to do that in a way that keeps options open for the longer term. So we know that hydrogen has a potential role to play. So we need to ensure that our rollout is smart and doesn't lock out that potential, whilst at the same time we ensure that we do make progress towards those targets and are not left waiting for hydrogen at some point in the future. We don't expect hydrogen to play a significant role before the late 2020s at the earliest, if not further into the 2030s. Okay, next slide. So actually getting into the strategy and the actions that we've set out. The strategy sets out more than 100 actions, so I'm not able to give you sort of the full detail, but I will pick out some of the key highlights. So we recognise that public engagement is critical to the success of this challenge. The heat decarbonisation challenge is going to touch the lives of pretty much everyone in Scotland. So we need a really effective public engagement strategy to make sure that we're bringing people along with us on this journey, and that this is a transition that is happening with people, not just to them. So we've committed to developing a public engagement strategy, and one component of that is a new National Public Energy Agency, which we have also committed to, and its remit will be to accelerate the change that we need to see and have a role in providing sort of information to the public and expert advice. And we've also, for the first time, set out some guiding principles to handle that tension that I mentioned earlier about the costs of zero emissions heating, in some cases being higher than using fossil fuels. So we have some guiding principles to ensure that what we're doing on zero emissions heating is compatible with our fuel poverty objectives and doesn't exacerbate or deepen fuel poverty that we see in Scotland at the moment. Okay, next slide, please. So our second big theme is place. So whilst we call it the heat and building strategy, every building is located in a place, but not only that, it's also located in a sort of a certain position within the energy system. So in relation to the energy infrastructure and the sort of the supply of energy. So because of that, and because of Scotland's sort of varied geography, and also the need to make progress, we recognise that the transition may look different in different places, and so we want to have an approach that allows for a sort of a place-based, locally led and tailored approach. So we've been working to develop local heat and energy efficiency strategies with local authorities, and these the idea behind these is that they set out for a local authority area what the transition to zero emissions heat would look like in terms of what kinds of technologies are appropriate in which sorts of areas, and setting out plans for delivery to ensure that the transition across those areas. So this is quite a sort of a significant new innovation that we've been pioneering in Scotland. We want them to be sort of in place. We've been piloting them for a while. We want them to be fully in place by the end of 2023 across all local authority areas. And the approach the Scottish Government has been taking is that we want to see these on a statutory basis. So this would become a statutory requirement for local authorities. And we've committed to resourcing their development accordingly. So this wouldn't be sort of an additional burden on local authorities that's unfunded. Within that, one of the key things that we want LHEs, these local heat and energy efficiency strategies, to do is to align the planning system to make sure that the way that it supports low and zero emissions heating fits in with that sort of wider strategic picture. And we also want to harness the power of community and thinking about sort of settlements and how they can act together. So we're working to explore the role of climate action towns and community climate action hubs, and also working with the 7 cities in Scotland to develop a pipeline of projects. Okay, next slide, please. So as I said, each building is located within the energy system, and so we need to make sure that changes at the building level happen in coordination with changes across the energy system. So there are various dimensions to this. Issues around electricity system impacts the scale of networks and generation that's needed, the potential role for hydrogen and what that means around the gas network, and also the role of heat networks. The Scottish Government last year passed the Heat Networks Act, which provides for regulation of heat networks, and so that's one of the core things that we're taking forwards at the moment, is developing from that act spelling out the regulatory regime that we want to be in place, sort of the provisions coming into force in 2023 and 24. And that regulatory regime is really there to provide, to boost confidence and to provide certainty to sort of support lower cost investment going into heat networks. Alongside that, we have business rates relief that we use to support heat networks, and in the strategy we set out some enhanced relief for heat networks using renewable heat. And then more broadly, in terms of the energy system, these are largely reserved areas, but we take a proactive stance working with industry, UK government and Ofgem to understand the system's issues and to ensure that mitigations are put in place where necessary. And we also work to support development and demonstration projects. For example, we recently provided some funding to one of the big hydrogen demonstration projects, the H100 project. Okay, next slide, please. So, investment in the transition. This is also obviously a critical piece of the jigsaw. Our estimates are that the overall cost of the transition could reach as much as £33 billion in Scotland. That would be a sort of investment at the building level. And that's over the whole period through to 2045. Over the next sort of 5-year period, as we're looking to this sort of ramp up and acceleration of deployment, the Scottish Government has committed at least £1.8 billion of investment. And we're looking at that as a way of kickstarting market growth, as well as continuing to provide support for those least able to pay. We set out 4 strategic priorities to sort of direct the use of that funding. So the first is supporting those least able to pay. Second is sort of investing in the strategic technologies that are sort of ready in the near term in areas where there are no and low regrets. We have an emphasis on showcasing net zero leadership through early adoption. And so that covers a variety of areas, including upgrades to the public estate. And then also investment in innovation and demonstration. So the strategy sets out sort of expanded funding packages across a number of areas, including social housing. So we have a social housing net zero heat fund, which we've increased to £200 million. And similarly, we have a £200 million fund to invest in the public estate over the course of this Scottish Parliament. And we've also set aside £400 million to invest in large-scale projects. So this would be things like large district heating networks. And alongside those sort of funds that would work through institutions, we also have support programs that sort of support at the household level. So we have several programs targeting fuel poverty that, again, we're increasing funding into those. And we also have a system of low interest or zero interest loans that are accompanied by cashback grants. And through those, households in Scotland can receive up to £7,500 to support installation of renewable heat systems. Okay, next slide, please. So we recognise that what we're looking to do with that funding is to kickstart development in the market. But we also know that overall price tag of £33 billion is not something that could be entirely funded from the Scottish Government budgets. So we need to work towards an appropriate market framework, which creates the right incentives and makes it the natural choice more and more for households and building owners to install zero emissions heating. So that framework needs to sort of the 3 key planks that we've set out for it are to help create that demand for energy efficiency and zero emissions heating, to overcome what can sometimes be quite high upfront costs by helping to spread the costs through time, and making the sector more attractive so that we can secure other private investment and finance. So the actions that we're taking to deliver that, we are currently establishing a new green heat finance task force that will explore those issues and make recommendations to the Scottish Government about how it can work with the sector to mobilise more private finance into this area. There are sort of a range of additional options that we're exploring, ranging from work on green mortgages all the way through to considering options around local taxation and incentives that might be sort of available through that route. And also, we think it's very important that the disincentives that currently exist to switching to zero emissions heat be tackled. So one of those that may be familiar is the higher cost of electricity relative to gas, and the role of policy costs that are sort of established by UK government policy that are concentrated on the electricity bill. So we've been calling on the UK government to take action to rebalance those, and that's one of the areas that, because it's a reserved policy issue, we don't have the levers, so we need to work closely with UK government to achieve that. Okay, next slide, please. So as well as putting in place all of those sort of changes to make a switch to a zero emissions heat the sort of an available choice and something that makes sense, we also recognise that because of the pace at which we need to see this transition happen, and the fact that these are long-term decisions that really, at a building level, people need certainty and clear endpoints. We've committed to introducing new legislation that would create mandatory legal standards for zero emissions heating, and that builds on our sort of existing approach to using regulation to set minimum standards for energy efficiency as well. This is an area that we've set out in the strategy, what that would look like, and we need to ensure that we do that within the sort of the confines of what the Scottish what's devolved to the Scottish government. But broadly, if you have a look at the strategy, you'll see that across sort of different building types, so across different sort of housing tenures and also non-domestic building, we set out what those minimum energy efficiency standards would look like and the timing over which they would be brought in. In Scotland, we have, I mean, it's an issue common across the UK, but it's particularly acute in Scotland because we have a relatively high proportion of housing is in flats. So handling the issue of buildings that have a mixed use or are multi-tenure is one of their sort of the key focuses, and we want to build that into the way that the regulatory framework works. And acknowledging that we do need to see change happen quickly, and in some cases it may need to go ahead of sort of the natural replacement cycles in buildings for their heating systems. We're looking at a range of potential trigger points that would lead to buildings being required to upgrade their energy efficiency and their heating systems. So they may relate to things that happen at the building level, so change of tenancy or sale or a major refurbishment, but we're also exploring the possibility of using area-based triggers. So this could link back to the local heat and energy efficiency standards, and this would support the rollout of zero emissions heating where there are shared and common issues. So heat networks is one obvious example where that may be play an important role. These regulations would be new, so they would obviously be subject to detailed consultation, but we aim to bring them in so they are ready to start being enforced from 2024-25. Next slide, please. We see the transition to zero emissions heat as well as being a significant challenge. There's a significant economic opportunity there as well. So our estimate is that there are potentially 16,400 additional jobs arising just from the deployment of zero emissions heat, potentially more if you factor in energy efficiency. So that's on top of the sort of the jobs that already exist in across the sort of supply chains for heating at the moment. And as part of our commitment to a just transition, we will act to ensure that we get the most out of building local supply chains and maximising local job creation. To do that, we're going to be working with industry to co-create a heat and building specific supply chain delivery plan, and also later this year we'll be publishing a policy statement with our position on quality assurance and consumer protection, and that should help across the industry to make clearer the kinds of skills requirements that are going to be needed and the routes by which people can get those qualifications. Okay, next slide, please. So that has been relatively brisk canter through the heat and buildings strategy. I would encourage you to read the strategy. It has quite a lot more detail than I've been able to set out, and we have sort of an email address here. So if anybody has sort of any questions or anything they'd like to follow up on, please do contact us on that. And I think I'll stop there, and I think it's over to questions.
David, thank you so much. I thought that was absolutely fascinating, and I think it would be well worth people on this conference call today reading the strategy and making representations as appropriate to Welsh Government in some similar but different circumstances in the context of Wales. Can I just clarify a couple of points? The first one was that what I really like about what you said so far is that you're pushing everybody to do the right thing in the context of climate. So you've got a number of mechanisms where you're looking for regulation that will drive behaviour. And so you're going to have your local heat and energy efficiency strategies on a statutory basis in all local authority areas, that you will have a regulatory regime for heat networks, including business rate relief, which you've got through your Heat Networks Act, and you're going to have mandatory legal standards for new zero emissions heating by 2024. So between 2022 and 2024, if I've picked those three things up separately together, there is no part of the sector that will, in the context of buildings, that will be able to avoid behaving well in the context of climate. Is that right?
Well, I think it is. I mean, I think the we do need to sort of action across all sectors, and we do have sort of policy that cuts across all sectors. And so in social housing, we've been working with landlords on the energy efficiency standard for social housing, and will be reviewing the sort of the next level of that standard to ensure that it aligns with what we've set out for zero emissions heating. I suppose we're looking at sort of the period sort of over that you set out over the course of this parliament to be sort of developing those requirements and regulations, and they will be being brought in. And we need to make sure that we're not sort of creating requirements that people can't comply with. So we need all of the sort of the growth in the supply chain and the market framework to happen at the same time. So I think that's right. As we are bringing in those regulations, the trigger points that we use, and the ways in which the sort of compliance is required, the phasing and the timing of that is really important to get right, and get it aligned with sort of what we can do in terms of growth of supply chains and skills. And so in some respects, we don't want to think about it as a chicken and egg. It is this sort of multi-dimensional puzzle, and you need to be ensuring that you're getting progress on all fronts.
Yeah, I mean, I think what interested me particularly in the context of potential lessons in a country like Wales, which is to say has some very similar circumstances. I mean, the numbers will be different, but they're a substantial off-gas community. I'm one of those where I live. We moved over to a ground source heat pump last year, for example. But what was really interesting when we did is actually finding it difficult to find so many suppliers who had experience of installing such pumps. So we had quite a lot of initial teething problems, all sorted now. But, it's this issue about how you train up, how you skill up the workforce. So the experience of the resident is not negative as they move from tried and trusted systems onto new ones. So I was particularly interested in your local heat and energy efficiency strategies, and whether the expectation on the local authorities is they will work with the social housing providers in their area to make sure they absolutely nail that, and whether the content of those strategies is subject to regulation, or will the regulation just be requiring them to have strategies?
So I think these strategies are, I suppose, what the pilots have revealed to us is that they are quite complex. So in some respects, what they are likely to end up being is if you like a co-production between the Scottish government and local authorities. So we've been working hard with our delivery partners to build up a methodology that local authorities can use, and that's part of the commitment that we have to resourcing them should we sort of succeed in putting them on a statutory basis. So I think the content of them and how the local authority works with others in their area, including social housing providers, that will be something that will be there in the guidance. And I think that's part of the reason to try and put them on a statutory basis is to make sure that they are a focal point for sort of bringing together different actors in that local space. So what one sort of clear example around that is the rollout of heat networks, and trying to coordinate the sort of the variety of stakeholders around a heat network, which could involve sort of both social housing providers and sort of large organizations. So, a university, for example, may have a large heat demand, and so local heat and energy efficiency strategies could well be that sort of critical focal point for that.
Yeah, thank you. And because you've made this big commitment about fuel poverty as well, which is absolutely essential, and was a point very strongly made by the IPPR this morning, in the sense this must be a fair transition. So different language is used about it in this context, but that commitment in terms of no one left behind and fuel poverty is really important. Has there been any specific work on working with tenants in both social housing, whether or not that's through council or through housing association providers, with any messages that might be helpful to people on this conference today as they move from deliberation to action?
Yes, so one piece of work that has been happening is we've been looking at ways in which a sort of a broader package than just zero emissions heat can work with sort of households who are in fuel poverty, including social housing tenants, to keep energy bills low whilst switching over to a zero emissions heat system. So we've been trialing the use of combining solar photovoltaics with energy storage alongside a heat pump. So any potential additional running costs that come through from having that sort of electric heat pump would be defrayed and offset by the savings that you make and the income that you may be able to generate from having that micro generation on board. So I think it is sort of it's a live area, and we're sort of approaching it and on multiple fronts.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful, because all countries will have slightly different emphases as they take forward their work, and it's going to be really important that we can all learn from each other. And in that vein, cheeky question to finish our interview. In the land of COP, where all eyes will be turned, or certainly probably all the eyes in this room, virtual room, will be turned at the end of this month and through the first 10 or 11 days in November. Are you taking your work to COP? And are there ways in which you think that there are opportunities for social housing providers to really get underneath whatever the messages from COP will be?
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of the first part of that, we certainly are very keen to take our work to COP and look to work to sort of build sort of alliances and working with sort of other sort of international partners on this challenge. And I think there's certainly sort of scope for social housing providers to be doing, participating in that and making those international links, so that I suppose, as our minister said, when we've launched the heat and building strategy, this is a very significant challenge, and nobody has achieved something like this before, and so nobody in the world really has the answers to how you would actually succeed with this. So it is a process of learning by doing, and the more that we can foster those sort of collaborative links both within the UK and internationally, I think that's really going to be important to ensuring success.
Yeah, no, Dave, thank you very much indeed. I mean, we're very aware that the Scottish Government is going to introduce an equivalent to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which was piloted in Wales. So it's going to be really good to see if the Celtic countries have a real opportunity to learn from each other in this setting. Thank you very much, Diolch yn fawr iawn yn ddod. Thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, David Hawkey.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
And now just another 10-minute break while you go and catch up on those emails or get that cup of coffee or tea. And please join us again by 3 o'clock this afternoon to join with our last speaker. of the day, a very, very special speaker. It sometimes is called a graveyard slot of the conference, but actually for me, it's often my absolutely favourite slot. And today we have sustainable design with Professor Yewande Akinola. And since she's the most extraordinary person with an amazing career and both an innovator, dreamer and speaker with a passion for the role of innovation, creativity and engineering, please join us for the last slot of the day. I'll see you then. Bye.